I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the traditional custodians of this land on which we're all meeting here today, and to pay my respects to elders past and present. And we are going to pay our respects to Stephen Dowling in this session today, who's no longer with us. He has been one of our community members for the last, since it started really in Asia Pacific for BVSSH. And the knowledge of his passing was filled with shock and sadness for many of us here in the Agile community in Melbourne and in Australia. Stephen was, if you don't know him, he was passionate about disruption, passionate about doing things in a better way. He was passionate about unlearning and relearning, and really, in order to have a better learning environment, we need to have psychological safety. So we are having this conversation today in his memory, in his spirit, to really talk about what are the ins and outs of psych safety, how do you actually have it so that we can have a better learning environment. So in memory of Stephen, thank you, Stephen. And so I would now like to hand over to Peter Bryce. So Peter is one of our other BVSSH community leaders, along with myself, and he is our lovely host for today. So I won't say any more. I'll hand straight over to you, Peter, and we can introduce our panel.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm really excited. I'm delighted to be here with you and our panelists. I'll introduce them in just a moment, but I just want to spend just a minute just to set the context for our discussion. As most of us here know, psychological safety is simply the lack of interpersonal fear in a group. And it's the feeling that we're in a safe place to speak up, to share ideas, to learn, to innovate, to be ourselves, and even to challenge the way that we work together. And we feel safe because rather than being ignored or punished or ridiculed for sharing our views, we expect to be heard and appreciated for bringing our unique perspective to the team. And when psychological safety is high, its promises that it brings a huge range of benefits to the team and to the organization. It's one of the patterns or foundational requirements for agility. But how is it possible? That's basically what we're here to find out. And I'm very grateful to have such an amazing panel with us today. So in no particular order, I'll just introduce them. Mukta Arya, Managing Director and Chief HR Officer for the giant European bank, Societe Generale, who's dialing in from Hong Kong today. Dr. Kat Page, who's Head of Talent and at National Australia Bank, one of the big four banks here, who's an organizational psychologist and a people and well-being strategist. We've also got Joel Madden, CEO of Evolution, who focuses on people dynamics and organizational performance. And Kieran White, who is the founder and chief vision officer of People Talking, which is the authorized training provider for Professor Amy Edmondson's The Fearless Organization Scan in Australia. So welcome everyone, and in particular, our panelists. Thank you so much for being here tonight. So let's kick off with a question here, really focusing on psychological safety. And I'd like to ask you, what does psychological safety, in your experience, look like in action? Is it different cultures? Could you just share a story, maybe highlighting the presence of psychological safety in a team that you've been in? Kieran, do you want to give us your perspective on this one?
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and hello, everybody. as I think about psychological safety in action, I think about its positive, impactful form. So for me, it's about leaders of teams being knowledgeable as regards what psychological safety is and isn't, being conscious and committed to establishing and maintaining, which are two very different things, establishing and maintaining the requisite level of psychological safety in their teams or across teams or across the business. But they don't stop there. Psychological safety isn't the goal. It's an enabler of something important. And that's what I get really excited about, is it's an enabler. So when it's in action, leaders and teams have actually made the link between psychological safety and something really important for their team or for their business, whether that they connect it to strategy, diversity and inclusion, health and well-being, the psychosocial elements. It could be ethical and moral decision-making. It could be teaming. It could be leadership development. So they've made this link between something they are trying to achieve together and the critical soil that is psychological safety. That's when it's in action, is that link is there. Does it vary across cultures? Yeah, I think so. I think I have some global experience, but my experience over the last number of years is more kind of weighted in Australia and New Zealand, where relative to perhaps North Americans or Dutch or South African, it's less direct. So there's an indirect element to the culture here that I think is worth considering when we think about psychological safety. And if I bring in Stephen's one of Stephen's lovely kind of words earlier on that I really appreciated hearing, even though I'd never met the man, disruption. So if you want disruption, you need to be ready for contact. So teaming is a contact sport, and psychological safety is difficult when conflict is in the room. It's not an easy thing. And I really appreciate how good leaders in action are working extra hard to invite in the voice of difference. And they don't stop there. So they know how to ask good questions. What are you thinking that's different to how I'm looking at this? I'd love to invite in a different perspective. That would be so helpful. So they give explicit permission to the voice of difference, and they are absolutely ready to respond productively when it comes out. The voice of difference is a challenge from a psychological safety perspective. And for me, it's the link between keeping a climate that's comfortable, because psychological safety can be comfortable, but without accountability, it misses its transition to high performance. And Amy has said, and is on record, she kind of regrets calling it psychological safety because it can miss the high performance piece. It's about sustainable high performance that works for the members in the team and for the business. So there's an accountability, there's a performance element, which means there needs to be contact and disruption. And I can give an example of where I've kind of seen it work and not work, and it was actually part of the same interaction. So this is a leadership development program. This is with a multinational that's based in Australia and New Zealand. The senior leadership team were present. It was about enterprise leadership. So it was about mobilizing the top 60 leaders across the business to collaborate more effectively going forward. And they had declared that psychological safety was a key enabler of their strategy. And in one interaction, 3 members of the senior leadership team had presented to the next 50 some elements of the strategy. And then they said, any questions? And I was sitting in the corner of the room, just kind of, observing. And this lady found her voice, and it was actually a bit shaky. And she said that she was struggling to make a really strong connection with the strategy. For her, the big picture was missing, and that she was concerned that when business looked to cascade its strategy, there wouldn't be buy-in because people wouldn't feel personally connected. Now, what a courageous thing to say. And these are the moments that matter from a psychological safety perspective. It's what do you do when you've created the space for voice to come in? And the senior leadership team member responded, once you become more familiar with the strategy and the thinking that we have put into it, I think the big picture will become a lot clearer. And that leader in that moment had failed. They had been too attached to leader as expert. And whilst what they were saying, you might argue, was kind of rational and real, you could almost feel the energy flow out of the room. And luckily, there was another leader there who hadn't presented, but was a senior leadership team member who came in almost immediately and addressed this person who had spoken up. I so appreciate you sharing your concern. How we have led strategy could have been much better. It's one of the reasons we are doing this program with you. I would love to hear more about your concerns and your ideas. I'm here to listen. They embodied humility and leader in learning. And the conversation that flowed as a result, because they made it safer and they explicitly validated the voice of difference when it came in. 2 moments of how to increase it and how to reduce it played out in the same moments.
Beautiful, beautiful example, Kieran. Thank you so much for sharing that. Kat, do you want to add something to that in terms of, what psychological safety looks like in action?
Sure. Kieran, I love everything that you've just said. And I come at this topic from, so I'm an org psych by background, and where I first came across psychological safety was actually from the angle of how do you create inclusive organizations. I think there are a lot of parallels there. And the reason why I bring that up is because I think you've done something really nicely there, Kieran, which is to take a concept that could be perceived as somewhat fluffy and a little bit woolly even, and you've done what I think is really important, which is to not necessarily come to the conversation talking about the concept because the concept's important, obviously it is, but to come at it from the angle of what are the business problems that an organization is trying to solve. Like, I think that should be the very first entry point, whether it be innovation, whether it be, through increased risk taking, whether it be performance. There's so many different angles you can come from, but to come in and start from that place, I think is really important. And that's something that that I've always tried to do. And actually one of my mentors, who Maria would know, Juliet Burke, is actually probably almost a decade ago now, was really clear with that concept with me, is that you can be the most passionate individual about a concept, but unless you actually come into that conversation talking about the business problems that we're trying to solve for, and then sort of where you can sort of introduce in the topic like a psychological safety. So I think Kieran has done a really good job of talking about the performance edge side of the concept. So perhaps if I can talk about it a little bit more from that felt experience. So as a person, how might that environment feel? So obviously the topic of psychological safety, as Amy would talk about it, is very much around that interpersonal environment. So it's not necessarily something you obviously could feel it at, and look at it from an organizational perspective, but I think it really, really does show up in the moments where something is noticed, something is felt, something is observed, and an individual makes a choice, is in a moment where they need to make a choice about whether or not to talk about something, whether or not they want to just hide something under the carpet, whether they want to call something out, whether they want to challenge the status quo. And I think there is a moment, I think often that would come up where I think psychological safety comes into play. Thinking about what it looks like in action, I mean, obviously you can look at the sort of textbook things around, are people talking about mistakes? Are they escalating information about results and about things that may not be working well? I've thought about it at its most basic level. I think the way it might show up in action is the conversation that's happening between peers, the frankness and that transparency and the messages that is happening when 2 peers have a conversation. Is that the same as the conversation that the people above are having? And you might have come across this concept of truth to power. When I worked in the UK, I worked a lot around this idea of truth to power. And the idea is that when we have big failures in organizations, someone always knows. Often it might come at the as a bit of a surprise to the executive or to the leader, but someone always knows. And so I think as a leader, if you are a leader or if you're working with leaders, one of the concepts that I think is quite important is about getting to truth. You know, how do we actually get to truth? Because there are different variations of truth. But if you are asking enough questions and sort of getting down to the core of something, someone always knows. And so there was a interesting article on this topic. And the idea is that a lot of us say, my door is always open. And at the surface level, that looks like a good thing to say. My door is always open. But when you're actually saying my door is open, there is a lot that you're saying implicitly without actually saying it. And one is that I have a door. You don't have a door. I can shut this door if I choose to do so. Number one. Number two is you come to me. I'm not going to come out to you. You come to me. And that, you know, that essentially the onus then sits with the individual to kind of do that. And there is, in every organization, whether you acknowledge it or not, there is a power dynamics are at play. And most of us are walking around essentially, I wouldn't say wearing a facade, but there is a version of us that we're probably more comfortable and more willing to show. So I think in a psychologically safe environment, to get back to the core of the question, is where the version of truth, if you like, that's being discussed at the most junior or lowest level, if you like, or the least powerful level of the organization is the same as what's being discussed at the top. I think that is something that you see in action. I think that's quite important. So thinking about the types of organizations, and if I could share an example around that, one of the questions was around, is it the same in every culture? My first instinct in responding to that question was yes. So I think psychological safety in terms of what it is the same in every organization, but how it actually manifests, how it's experienced, how you would build it in an organization, I think could be vastly different depending on the culture because of a number of factors. And I'll come to this with some examples, some as clients and some actually as me as a human has experienced. So I think one aspect of an organization that's quite important to acknowledge is whether or not an organization is quite a hierarchical organization. So my parents were police officers, and I actually spent an early part of my career working with police officers because I felt really passionate about wanting to address some of the challenges that are experienced within that organization. Now, obviously, policing, like many organizations, is quite a hierarchical organization. And having worked with Vic Pole and worked in particular with the most junior constables or probationary constables in the organization, this idea of actually owning up, even around things like, for example, they have a lot of, when you think of police officers, you might think of them, you know, chasing crooks and jumping out of helicopters and I don't know, you know, whatever it is that you might think, but actually they do a lot of admin and have really, really crap technology. They're not very agile. And there was numerous examples that were always brought up when I was working with the police around this idea of the workload that they have to do in terms of the admin, and quite often the probationary constables wouldn't know how to complete that workload, that administration. It was actually kind of hard, and they would tend to hide them in their lockers. And then they had this vehicle called chasers, where if they hadn't submitted their administrative work, they would get chasers until just chasing until they actually did it, without actually acknowledging the fact that in that environment, they didn't feel comfortable to put their hand up and actually say, I don't know how to do it, or there's something I don't know how to do. They were terrified of the more senior command. It was not okay to call out problems with systems or technology. It was like, you get it done or you don't. And then they were getting chased. And the stress that came from that was so significant. That was one example linked to, I think, a culture as well. Another one I think is there is sort of a different types of cultures around how you build trust and build relationships within organizations. So having worked at one organization, Deloitte, you know, the way that you built trust was actually through credibility and competence. And then you have other organizations where it's more around time in the role and feet under the desk and spending years literally making connections with people. I worked at another organization, Tennis Australia, where that was the status quo. And I moved to Tennis Australia having worked at Deloitte, where it was the opposite. It was all about innovation, diversity of thinking was key, inclusion was great. You could be a consultant challenging a director in some environments, that was completely fine. I went into the tennis environment and actually it was not like that at all. And I made the mistake of not unlearning and relearning what the culture was in that organization. And I remember challenging someone quite senior at one point around the lack of diversity on a panel, and I heard nothing. And then a couple of hours later, I got a call from someone with feedback, and actually a complaint had been made about me challenging the diversity on it and how I'd made people look bad. And I talked down about them in front of peers, and all of this kind of thing came up, and I was like, how on earth? That's in Deloitte, that would have been completely normal and completely okay. And actually that's around challenging the status quo, and in that environment, that was not okay. And that really stuck with me, that idea that not every culture is created equal. And then the last thing I'll say before I pass on to the next speaker is that obviously, even if psychological safety can look different in different industries, I think we should acknowledge that within an organization, there is not just one culture. Typically, there's multiple cultures, there's tribes of cultures, and so they're not all created equal. And back to what Kieran was talking about earlier, the behavior of the leader is so critical, and their belief in the concept and how they respond in moments like where somebody is challenging the status quo and has taken that personal risk is so important.
I would love to hear from our other panelists on this, but I want to move on to another question. And let's look at psychological safety as a pattern. And let me ask you this, and I'd love to hear from you, Mukta, on this one. So what behaviors or beliefs have you seen that psychologically safe teams have in common? And have you been able to help those behaviors emerge and strengthen in teams? And you're on mute.
Yeah, this topic is gaining more importance in organizations and in banks. I'm sure you would have heard of the speak up culture, which for me is related to the psychological safety that we have. So the behaviors that I see, or the patterns that I see in teams which are, according to me, psychological safe, is where the employees or the staff, they basically are, they don't fear the consequences, so they're not fearful of the consequences if they raise an issue, or if they, for example, talk about something which is, or if they have made a mistake, they come out and they say that, okay, I have made a mistake, and then what can we do about it? That I think is very important, where people are able to speak up to their managers, to the people around you, and not talking about it in hushed tones, So I think that is very important. The second is where the manager also, how do they actually take these kind of feedback? Are they reactive? Yeah. And a psychologically safe team, the manager is generally receptive to feedback, whether it's positive or negative, and maybe turn it in a constructive way, instead of blame storming or doing things which will make the person who raised the issue maybe feel that, oh, why did I do that? So this is what I normally see. I see people are generally happy, which I think is a no-brainer in psychologically safe teams. They do feel that they are relaxed and they are not under undue pressure, because, the teams which are not psychologically safe, their people are walking on, eggshells, where they don't even know what their managers are going to do the next thing, or the behavior is unpredictable. Yeah, so I see some of the patterns in psychologically safe and unsafe teams here. And of course, some of the patterns are where employees feel that even if they raise something, say if they do not like something about their manager, they know that it will be taken badly. And if they raise it to the level above, nothing will be done, because maybe they feel that the manager is friendly with their super manager. So different kind of things. I can go on and on, but these to me are the most important ones. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And you've got teams in probably 5 or 6 different countries across the region, right? Do you see cultural differences in the way that you can build psychological safety in those teams?
Yeah, it's in some it is like, for example, in Australia, I think it's pretty, people are quite vocal. But when I go to Japan and Korea, it becomes a little bit less, and then people sometimes would keep things to themselves. For me, how I would build it, that even though I have country HR heads in different countries, but when I travel or visit them, or I have virtual meetings, with my N-2s, I talk to them, and also try to create an environment where they can talk about it, because on their own, they may not come out with it. But when you ask them, or when you, for example, create an environment where they feel safe, they will come out with it. So two kind of cultures, one where people will proactively come up with things that they want to talk about, and they are fine with it. But in majority of the Asian cultures, for me, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, to some extent China, and even Singapore, for example, sometimes you have to really goad, or not not provoking them, but basically giving them the environment or the platform to air themselves, so that's how. But cultural differences are definitely there. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks, Kieran. Do you see patterns of behavior that produce psychological safety in your work?
Yeah, it is, and just linking on what Mukta talked about there, and the kind of leaders' work linked to cats. I think there's a theme and a pattern where leaders take on the extra consciousness that they have an overweighted relationship with psychological safety. So when we measure psychological safety in teams, the person who rates the level highest in teams is 90% of the time the leader. So there's a pattern where leaders are conscious of this and take responsibility for working extra hard to create that platform to make other people safer, not themselves. And there's another pattern emerging, I think, as we're having this conversation around the construct of psychological safety, is that seeing a shift from the focus where it's originally from is in teams, and we can measure that, and all Amy's research is around that. The pattern that kind of seeing and working with organizations on is that there's a lot more focus on enterprise-wide or horizontal collaboration across teams. And what we're noticing when we measure psychological safety at an enterprise level is it's lower than within teams. So there's a fascinating pattern showing up where the interface between critical teams, it could be planning and operations, it could be IT, and it doesn't really matter, but within teams, it's higher than across teams. And the complexity now is really prompting organizations to tap into the diversity across functions and overcome silos. And it's throwing up a new pattern of insights where the level of psychological safety, when we think enterprise level, is lower than vertically and within teams. And we're going to learn a lot over the next few years how to really work with that.
Very interesting, isn't it? Diversity really comes to life when you have psychological safety. Joel, I'd love to hear from you too. We've talked about the patterns of psychological safety. Let's talk for a minute about the possibility. So, in your view, how can we expand psychological safety from individual teams to the whole organization or the whole sector?
Yeah, that's a good question, Peter. And I've been sitting here being a wonderful participant and realizing that I had to now speak. So thank you to the panelists who've been talking so far. And I'll continue on the theme that Kieran started there. And I think if you accept that psychological safety is a group level phenomenon, then it can exist at multiple levels in an organization. To take that cross-team experience. So if I was a leader or a manager of a team working with other peers, that group could experience psychological safety, but the team that I return to might not. So if you consider it at a group level, it's a really powerful tool, because saying that I feel psychological safety doesn't mean that anybody else does. In fact, it could mean that you're the only person saying what you think. And I think looking at it through that frame you start to really understand how powerful it can be, and how important it is to think really critically and from almost an out of body perspective to evaluate where things are at. How do
Tell
you
me more
scale
about
it?
that concept, out of body? Can you clarify that, John? That sounds like a really
I
interesting
think
concept.
I think I talk a lot about self-awareness at individual level within teams, and then a collective self-awareness of the team. And that requires a lot of self-analysis, and it requires you to step back and look at what's happening around you from a self-aware perspective. When you look at that, that's a skill-based approach. So how do you scale it? I'm a strong advocate for investing in teams looking at group dynamics, investing in teams looking at emotional intelligence at an individual level, but then scaling that. What does emotional intelligence look like at a team level? How aware of the team processes are we? And then investing in and looking at what are the micro skills that I can show day to day that demonstrate that I'm trying to grow a psychological safety environment around me. And that sort of approach scales, because you can use that at the C-suite and you can use that on the shop floor.
Great point. Kat, have you got some comments about not only scaling psychological safety, but embedding it culturally and structurally in an organization? Is that something that's possible?
I mean, I think with any large scale change or transformation where you're embedding something, if you just even think safety culture more broadly, like put aside the psychological piece, I think anytime you're trying to embed something, that I think there are at least 5 different stories that you need to be telling at once to people, because you've got some people who will come to this topic and connect with it on a values level. And those are the easier people to influence, if you like. Then you've got other people who are sort of wanting to more see the data. They might want to see it linked to financial outcomes. It might be around understanding kind of the detail and the processes. So I think as leaders in this space, if you're wanting to embed this, it's not enough to just speak your language, because we all have there's different hooks, I suppose, that we need to connect to. But I think the role of leaders, if you start with that segment, and it's interesting always talking about leaders, because obviously leaders are the focus of almost any kind of change that we're wanting to make. But I do think it's because they do have such a critical role. I think it is that in terms of visibly demonstrating it. I think inclusive leadership is, if you've come across that concept, I think if you can really target leaders who understand and value the benefits that come from difference. So I think you spoke earlier, Peter, about, or might have been Kieran actually, about the value of difference. Particularly when we're thinking about that in the context of agile, or as we call it domains at NAB, really the value that you're trying to bring, particularly we've got technology sort of agile domains, is very deliberately and consciously and intentionally bringing together people with very diverse skill sets to the picture. And if you just put those individuals into a room together and say, off you go and deliver customer outcomes, like you just are not going to get that return. So I think it's the having leaders who actually get fundamentally that in order for them to meet their performance metrics, and in order for us to meet customer metrics, which is the critical language that we think about at NAB, they have to be able to almost be the lead from within, like almost be that conductor where they're actually getting the best out of each individual and that diversity. And I think the other thing about embedding it in culture is another thing that I've really learned over time is the simplicity is so important. So I think sometimes we come in, we've got this big story of change, and then some leaders are just so good at making it so simple and just repeating that over and over again, to the point where you start to actually hear people repeating those same patterns, if you like, those same messages back to you. It's not necessarily, not all leaders can go out there and inspire millions. But if you actually break down how leaders are doing that, it's the simple, repeatable, consistent messages, perhaps conveyed in different ways to different audiences, because every single day there's so much coming at us that is actually working against what we're trying to change. So I think quite often we think about what we're trying to change and how we want to embed that, but what are all of the forces that are in play within the organization that are actually working in opposite to what you're trying to achieve, and thinking about how you actually tackle or deal with those opposing forces is almost as important as the trying to get that message across. I think, yes, I might just park there. Yeah.
Great point, and it really leads very nicely to our final question, and we're going to get to the questions from our audience in a minute as well. But we've talked about the pattern of psychological safety, the promise of it, the possibility of it, rather. What about the promise? What I'd love to hear from our panelists. Mukta, maybe you could kick off. What advice would you give to someone who's leading a team, who wants to start to build the psychological safety in that team? What is one thing that they could do tomorrow to help strengthen the psychological safety of that team?
My advice will be really to, first of all, the basics of management, but getting to know your people, maybe have one-on-one relationship, talk about the concerns that they have, the good things that are there, etc. So I think that relationship is quite important. And second is when somebody comes with an idea or a critique, of a policy or a procedure, listen to it with an open mind, before reacting. I think we can control our reactions, to whatever happens in the world, and really be present in the moment. Really, the coaching skills that should be there, we have to employ it here to be a manager who can create a psychologically safe environment. Listen to people, be present in the moment, don't look at your phone, etc. when people are talking about it. And when something goes wrong, be, I would say, calm and try to find solutions instead of, sort of blowing it out. So for me, it is walking the talk. It's how we behave as managers and leaders, which will really have an impact on the people that we lead. So really, be calm, even if you are boiling inside. I would say that our reactions are very important for the team that we lead. And once we do that and we show that we listen and we care, people will open up. So employees will open up. Yeah.
Really simple things are hard to do consistently, right? Joel, what would you say? What advice would you give someone? What one thing could you do tomorrow to help build the psychological safety of your team?
Look, I'd say I'd continue on a bit of a theme and say reflective practice is really important. And going back to Kieran's example of two leaders who demonstrated the two sides of how you can grow psychological safety and how you can shut it down, I'd say start with moving beyond the headlines of show empathy, listen actively. So move beyond that into what skill, what are you actually going to do to grow psychological safety and support it? And there's a little thing that I always go to, and I say, if somebody says something that you weren't expecting, or somebody says something that is a bit controversial, or that you don't agree with, respond in a way that shows curiosity and encourages further discussion. So you might say something like, "That's really interesting. I haven't thought about that before. I'm really curious to know more about it. Can you tell me more?" All right. And that can work with all of those different combinations. It was unexpected, it was controversial, you disagree with it, but you're encouraging further conversation in a safe, non-judgmental way.
Beautiful, beautiful. Kieran, could you give us one thing that you would suggest to a leader that they do tomorrow to help improve the psychological safety of their team?
Yeah, stop the meeting 15 minutes before the end and invite the team to talk about and explore what have we learned about ourselves as a team today? What have we learned about this topic? Stimulate the learning environment with explicit signals that we are here to learn and not just do.
Love that. Love that. And what about you, Kat? What one?
I'm having trouble thinking about just one. I'm having trouble thinking about just one, Peter. So if I could just be naughty and think about a couple. One is, I think as leaders, we need to recognize that you don't realize how scary you are to some people. Because I think because we're aware of our self-talk, all the things we worry about and getting things wrong, we don't necessarily put that self-talk on the outside. And if people don't know us, we can actually be quite intimidating. So I often say that to leaders, it's your job to actually make yourself less scary. So how do they do that? One is to talk about and own your own mistakes. I worked with a leader recently who was an engineer, incredibly smart person, and she was just terrifying to people. She had no idea, because inside she had all these things that she was worrying about, but on the outside she was terrifying. So we actually got her opening a workshop talking about some feedback she'd had recently on a 360 that had really hit her hard, and asking for her team's support in noticing when some of these things were showing up. To the point around learning as well, something that we did in the Victoria Police environment was we introduced a new model of feedback, which was no longer about one way. It was called the Ask Ad model of feedback. And if you think about the fact that psychological safety is so important because it's about creating that sense of learning, and it's quite future focused. So what this model does is actually say to people, say they've delivered a workshop as an example, and you say, what do you think you did well? What would you do differently next time? And then those kind of ideas of what would you do differently next time, it immediately takes a focus to, I assume there will be a next time. I assume you will do it differently and do it better. And it's much more forward looking. And it's a much more comfortable, safer way for people to give feedback as well, than we typically might see with a one-way model of feedback. Sorry, Peter, that was, I know, probably like
No,
4 or
that's
5.
all right. No, there's some great suggestions there from all of our panelists.